Chapter 15, The Cheerleaders' Cruise. The tennis machine had fallen silent. Soon after 4 o'clock, the players began to leave the courts and make their way home to a late siesta. Waiting for Bobby Crawford, I sat in the Citroen outside the bar where the amateur whores patrolled the night. One by one, the cars turned through the gates of the Club Nautico, drivers happily exhausted, dreaming of the perfect backhand brought to them by this handsome evangel of the baseline. Crawford was the last to leave. At 5:15, the shark-like snout of his Porsche appeared at the gates. It paused as he scanned the road, then accelerated past me with a throaty burble. He had changed from his tennis gear into a leather jacket. Gangster black against his white shirt, and his blow-dried blonde hair gleamed from the shower. With his dark shades, he resembled a likable young actor in his James Dean phase, chewing a knuckle as he pondered his next film role. Behind his head, the torn roof liner fluttered in the wind. I let a few cars pass and followed him towards the Plaza Iglesias. The Porsche waited at the traffic lights, exhaust thrumming among the motor scooters and diesel taxis. With the sun visor lowered, I pulled in behind a bus to Fuengirola packed with British tourists, clutching their souvenirs of Estrella de Mar, miniaturized busts of the Apollo Belvedere, Art Deco lampshades, and videos of Stoppard and Radigan productions. Untouched by snobbery, Crawford waved to the tourists, giving a cheerful thumbs up to their choices. When the lights changed, he pulled sharply to the right in front of the bus, barely missing the bull bars of an oncoming truck, and set off down the Calle Molina for the old town. For the next hour, I trailed him around Estrella de Mar along an itinerary that seemed to trace a secret map of this impulsive man's mind. He drove almost without thinking, and I guessed that he took the same route every evening when he finished his duties at the Club Nautico's tennis coach, and set off to visit the outposts of a very different kingdom. After a quick circuit of the Paseo Maritimo, he returned to the Plaza Iglesias and left the Porsche with its engine idling. He crossed the central gardens to the open-air cafe beside a newspaper kiosk and joined the two brothers who spent their nights outside the doors of the Club Nautico disco. Edgy but affable, these former East End car dealers sometimes offered me a generous discount on a new shipment of Moroccan hashish brought in by powerful speedboat whose engines Gunnar Anderson turned so expertly. Leaving their iced tea, they stood up to greet Crawford with the deference of experienced NCOs towards a trusted young officer. They spoke softly as Crawford scanned his diary, ticking off entries in what seemed to be his order book. When they returned to their tea, supplies assured, Crawford signaled to a beefy Maghrebian in a dark uniform who sat at the shoeshine stand. This was Elizabeth Shand's chauffeur, Mahood, who had watched me with his sour gaze while logging my license number into his electronic notepad. After pressing a roll of pesetas into the shoeshine boy's blackened hand, he joined Crawford in the Porsche. They circled the plaza, turned into a narrow side street, and stopped outside the Baalbek Lebanese restaurant, a popular rendezvous and pickup point for rich Arabs sailing down the coast from Marbella. While Crawford waited in the Porsche, the chauffeur entered the restaurant and emerged moments later with 2 fair-haired women in gaudy tops, leather microskirts, and white stilettos. They pretended to blink at the open air as if sunlight was a phenomenon they had never experienced at first hand. With their patent handbags, they were dressed in a high-style pastiche of Pigalle streetwalkers, their garish garb incongruously assembled from the racks of Estrella de Mar's most expensive boutiques. As the taller of the two hobbled along the narrow sidewalk, I recognized under the platinum wig another of the mourners at Bibi Jansen's funeral, the English wife of a yacht broker with offices at the marina. She was doing her best to play the whore, fleshing out her mouth and rolling her hips, and I wondered if this was all the whim of some avant-garde theater director staging a street production of Mahogany or Irma la Douce. The women joined Mahood in the back of a taxi which sped towards the luxury apartment houses of the High Corniche. Satisfied to see them off to work, Crawford stepped from the Porsche and locked its doors. He strolled past the parked cars in the side street, right hand hidden in the folds of his jacket, testing the door latches. When the passenger door of a silver Saab opened to him, he slipped into the driver's seat and reached under the steering wheel shroud. I watched from the doorway of a tapas bar as he expertly jumped the car's ignition circuits. When the engine began to turn, he pulled the Saab out of the parking lane and accelerated down the cobbled street, clipping the wing mirrors of the stationary cars. By the time I returned to the Citroën, I had lost him. I drove around the plaza and then searched the harbor and the old town, waiting for him to reappear. I was about to give up and set off for the Club Nautico when I saw a group of tourists outside the Lyceum Theater Club and the Calle Dominguez trying to calm an impatient driver. Crawford's stolen Saab was boxed into the curb by an unattended pickup van loaded with Egyptian costumes for a forthcoming production of Aida. Before anyone could find the driver, Crawford shouted his thanks and drove forward, ramming the Saab into the space between the van and the car parked ahead of him. There was a rasp of torn metal as a wing buckled, and a headlamp shattered and fell between the wheels. The costumes danced on their hangers, a line of drunken pharaohs. Smiling to the startled tourists, Crawford reversed and then threw the Saab forward again, his arms raised as the van's crushed wings stripped the paint from his door. No longer bothering to conceal myself, I followed Crawford when he broke free and resumed his circuit of Estrella de Mar, part inspection tour and part criminal jaunt. His route took him through a hidden Estrella de Mar, a shadow world of backstreet bars, hardcore video stores, and fringe pharmacies. Not once did money change hands, and I assumed that this whirlwind cruise was primarily inspirational, an extension of his cheerleader's role at the Club Nautico. Towards the end, he parked again in the Plaza Iglesias, left the Saab, and plunged into the crowds that overflowed the pavements outside the galleries and bookstores. Ever smiling, his face as open as a friendly adolescent's, he seemed popular with everyone he met. Storekeepers offered him a pastis, shop assistants were happy to flirt with him. People rose from their cafe tables to banter and jest. As always, I was struck by how generous he was, giving off himself as if drawing on a limitless source of warmth and goodwill. Yet just as freely he stole and shoplifted. I watched him pocket an atomizer from a perfumery on the Calle Molina, then skip along the sidewalk spraying scent at the feral cats. He supervised a streetwalker's makeup in the Galleria Don Carlos, examining her eyeliner with the seriousness of a beauty specialist, then slipped past her into the nearby bodega and helped himself to 2 bottles of Fundador that he placed between the feet of the winos dozing in a nearby alley. With the deftness of a conjurer, he spirited a pair of crocodile shoes from a display stand under the nose of the store's manager, and minutes later emerged from a busy jewelry shop with a small diamond on his little finger. I assumed that he was unaware of my presence 20 yards behind him, but as we crossed the gardens of the Plaza Iglesias, he waved to Sonny Gardner, who stood on the steps of the Anglican church, mobile phone to his plump lips. The sometime barman and sail rigger nodded to me when I walked past him, and I realized that others had probably joined Crawford on his evening crime spree. Returning to the battered Saab, Crawford waited for me to take the wheel of the Citroën and start the overheated engine. Tired of the town and its tourist crowds, he left the plaza and drove past the last of the shops towards the residential streets on the wooded slopes below the Hollinger mansion. He led me in and out of palm-lined roads, always keeping me in sight, and I wondered if he intended to break into one of the villas. Then, as we circled the same traffic island for the 3rd time, he suddenly accelerated away from me, lapped the Citroën, and sat on my tail before swerving off into the maze of avenues. His horn sounded a series of cheery toots that faded across the hillside, the friendliest of goodbyes. "20 minutes later, I found the Saab outside the drive of a large, half-timbered villa 200 yards from the gates of the Hollinger estate. Beyond the high walls and security cameras, an elderly woman watched me from an upstairs window. Crawford, I decided, had caught a lift from a passing driver, and the inspirational tour of Estrella de Mar had ended for the day. I walked over to the Saab and gazed at its battered bodywork and bypassed ignition system. Crawford's fingerprints would be all over the vehicle, but I was sure that the owner would not report the theft to the Guardia Civil. As for the volunteer police force, its main function seemed to be the preservation of the existing criminal order, rather than the tracking down of miscreants. Twice during Crawford's jaunt around Estrella de Mar, the police patrol's Range Rovers had provided him with an escort and kept an eye on the stolen Saab while he shoplifted in the Plaza Iglesias. Exhausted by the effort of chasing Crawford, I sat down on the wooden bench beside a nearby bus stop and gazed at the battered car. A few feet from me, a flight of stone steps climbed the hillside towards the rocky summit above the Hollinger house. Whether or not by coincidence, Crawford had left the Saab at almost the exact spot where Frank's Jaguar had been found with its incriminating flask of ether and gasoline. It occurred to me that the arsonist had reached the lemon orchard by climbing the steps. On his return, seeing the Jaguar by the bus stop, he had seized the opportunity to implicate its owner by leaving the unused flask on its rear seat. Consigning the Citroën to the care of the elderly woman's security cameras, I began to mount the worn limestone steps, centuries older than Estrella de Mar, according to a local guidebook I had read. They led to an observation post constructed during the Napoleonic Wars. The perimeter walls of the adjacent villas reduced their width to little more than my shoulders. Beyond the encroaching shrubbery, a hang glider turned in the cloudless sky, the pilot's visored helmet silhouetted against the rustling canopy.